Hey folks, Dennis here with Las Vegas Worm Farm and the Living Soul community, and we're back for another worm topic of the week. This week, we're actually diving into more of a worm topic instead of a biological topic. And this week, we're talking about worm castings, what they are, why gardeners should use them, how you should use them, and how they help things in your soil and in your garden, especially right now during the summer. So let's dive right into it. Right into it. The first thing we'll talk about is what are worm castings, right? A lot of people think that worm castings are fertilizers. They're used to feed your plants, right? And while there are some nutrients in there, right, it is very little. You would be better off getting a bag of compost than a bag of worm castings if you're going to feed your plants. I know, crazy, right? Stick with me and I'll tell you why. What are worm castings are basically created in the body of a worm. The worm takes in organic material, right? It processes that organic material. It goes through its mouth, its esophagus, its gizzard, and then into the intestine, or its crop gizzard into its intestines, and then gets expelled out as a waste product. Well, while this food is processing through its body, it's actually getting broken down and enriched, but not with nutrients. It's actually getting enriched with microorganisms, right? Enzymes and other things. But the nutrient portion of it is just a small portion of it, right? It's not as big as people think it is. So back in the day, there used to be numbers on worm castings, which is your NPK, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, right? Those numbers usually aren't on worm castings anymore because they were usually 0, 0, 0 or 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. Maybe you got a 1 in there, but that's about it. So there wasn't really a lot of nutrients in there. Think of worm castings like, you have to think of worm castings not like compost, not like food, right? It is literally biology. That's what you're getting with worm castings, okay? You're getting microorganisms, and those microorganisms help create food for your plants. So that's what worm castings are. They are organic material. It used to be living at one point. Now it's not. The worm goes and that goes through the worm's body, stomach, intestine, or gizzard, intestine, and then comes out the back end as a worm casting or a cast or a ball of poop that is encapsulated. It's really round and it's encapsulated with mucus, so that it's these little fine particles. That's why if you ever get it, it's kind of like sand when it starts getting dry. It's really like flowy, and that's what worm castings actually are. So why would we use worm castings? Well, you wouldn't. If you're in a traditional system where you're using right chemicals to be able to grow your plants, you wouldn't. Like I said, there's no nutrients really in worm castings, so that's not helping you out. You're really going to get your nutrients from other places. Now, when would I use worm castings? Well, if you're trying to grow organically, right? If you're trying to grow the most nutrient dense foods, the most pest resistant plants, right? Then you would want to use worm castings. So those worm castings you would want to use at the very earliest stages of the plant's life as possible, right? Because these worm castings and the biology that's in it actually build a relationship with the roots of the plants. And that is how you get your plants to grow as good as possible. So if you are an organic grower, you're trying to grow the most nutritious foods, and you're trying to do it in a way that mimics what Mother Nature does, then worm castings are a way to do that, right? If you're already adding compost to your soil, that's great. That's good for the worm castings. If you're adding, your food scraps to an in-ground worm bin, that is amazing. The worm castings will help take that organic material and turn it into nutrients for your plants. If you're putting out their eggshells, if you're putting out blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, oatmeal, sea kelp, fish emulsion, if you're putting out any of these organic materials into your garden, you need worm castings. You need the biology to help create nutrients for your plants from that. If you just put that stuff out there, it will never turn into anything that your plant can actually uptake. Okay. So you have to have the worm castings to be able to do that. That is why we use worm castings. Worm castings are the cooks in the garden. They take ingredients, they cook it down so that the plants can eat it. That's basically what happens. They take the organics, they're cutting and chopping it, frying it, right? Flipping it, doing what they need to. And then they're like, here you go, eat it. And they feed it to the plants. That's really what happens. So, who should be using these, right? So, we already kind of talked about organic growers. If you're an organic grower, then you should definitely be using worm castings to get that biology out there. Other folks that should be using biology are if you're a vegetable gardener or a grower, if you grow flowers, if you're in a raised bed, if you're in containers, if you do house plants, if you do fruit trees, if you have an orchard, if you have a vineyard, if you have a pasture, if you are trying to grow anything that has roots in the ground, you should or can benefit from using worm castings. Get the biology out there into the soil. If it grows, it uses microbes. Okay. That's if it grows, it uses microbes. That kind of rhymes, right? It that's the process. That's what Mother Nature has created. That is her system that she uses all the time. And it doesn't matter if it's vegetables, if it's grapes, if it's cedars, it doesn't matter if it's flowers, it doesn't matter if it's an indoor house plant, and it doesn't matter if it's a cactus, a Joshua tree, you name it. If it's got roots in the ground, it's got to get nutrients somehow, and it's using that biology to be able to do that. So if it's got roots and it's growing, try some worm castings and see what happens, right? I guarantee you something will happen. All right. If you find this type of stuff interesting, do me a favor, give it a like, share, or join our community at School, the Living Soil community on School. There'll be more information in the description, but for right now, let's get back to it. The next question I always get is, where should we use worm castings? Where do we use them? You use them everywhere, all over the place. You use them in raised beds. You definitely need them in raised beds. You definitely need them in containers. In the ground, they will definitely be beneficial there. If you've got big trees, little trees, shrubs, vines, they will definitely work there, and in your house plants. So let me explain. You can use them in all these places because of the plants have roots, especially if you are in something that was created, as in not in the ground. In the ground, there's microorganisms there, right? But sometimes when we do containers or pots or in a raised bed or something like that, we've created that soil, right? So we've grabbed compost, or we've grabbed vermiculite or perlite or a sphagnum peat moss or coco coir, and we've created this, right? Well, when we create that, a lot of those materials are pretty sterile. There's not a lot of living things in there, right? So you have to get the biology back in there. The worm castings is the way you do that. Now, if you're in the ground, a lot of the time, even if the ground dries out, there's a lot of spores and other things that are, maybe they're dormant. There's some in there, right? Which is good. They'll wake up and maybe they'll multiply if conditions are right. But if we have something that we're creating and we haven't used anything from outside or in the ground, there might not be any life in it. And that's where you really should use the worm castings, right? One other reason is that if you're using it in a container and that container is outside, right? Not houseplants, but outside, and you've got these temperature changes. The summertime gets really hot and then it gets really cold in the wintertime. Those microorganisms, they don't always stay alive all the time, right? Sometimes they need to be replenished, right? And there's different microorganisms. Some of them live in the summertime, some of them live in the wintertime, some of them live in the springtime, all different types. What we want to make sure is that those guys get replenished on a regular basis. This is why using worm castings in all of these locations is super important, right? And I always tell folks that, again, if you're in a container, it is super important to get the biology in there. If you're buying all of your inputs from a bag from a big box store, there's probably no life in it. If there's life, it's very little, and then it's probably all bacteria, which is not a good thing. You need everybody, right? So where should you use it? You should use it everywhere. In your seed mix, in your raised bed mix, in your potting soil mix, in the ground, every time you transplant before the season change, you should be using it everywhere. Now, how do you use the worm castings, right? Sometimes I get questions like, because I always tell folks that like you want to get as close as possible to the roots of the plants, which is absolutely true, right? You do, and people are like, well, how do I do that if I have existing plants? Hold on, we'll get there. So the first thing is, if you're making a mix, you can do it inside of the mix, right? But don't forget that worm castings are very expensive, and it's because you're buying biology, right? Living critters. So you don't really want, use a bunch of worm castings in a, 100 square foot garden or half an acre, right? Like that's just, you're never going to be able to buy it. It's going to be too expensive. That's what I'm trying to get at. So how do we best utilize it? Well, if you've got a seed mix, get it into the seed mix because you're probably not going to make a lot of that. The next thing is that every planting hole that you're putting your plants in, put it at the bottom, right? There's always recommendations. I mean, we had I think it was a 1 quart cup, a 1 quart container, and you just need a couple of tablespoons. That's it, right? So if you're talking about a little pint cup, 1 teaspoon, I mean, you should be set. That's all you really need. The biology, as long as it has food, water, and air, it will multiply, and then it will take over and build a relationship with that plant, aka it's going to touch the roots, and then the plant's going to love that, and then it's going to feed the plant, right? So how do you use it? That's usually what I tell folks to do. But I have another way to use it if you've already got plants that are in the ground, right? And this kind of goes to the next thing, which is when should we use it? But how do we use it? The next way you can use it is to create an extract, not a tea, not a leachate, an extract. We're just pulling the biology off of the organic material, right? Because they're glued on there. Yes, they create enzymes and glues, and they stick themselves to organic material, but we're going to pull them off. We're going to put them in the liquid solution, and then we're going to pour them onto the plants that we need to use. Okay. I've got a video on this. If you go to LasVegasWormFarm.com, you go to worm castings on the right, there should be a video, go about halfway through, and I'll show you how to do that. You got to be careful. You don't want to kill them all, right? But we're going to basically put them in a bucket of, we'll put the worm castings in a bucket of water. We're going to shake the worm castings, right, for about 30 seconds or so. We're going to knock all of those worm castings off. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. You can also use a hose with a sprayer. Just make sure it's dechlorinated water, right? We don't want to use city water with chlorine because chlorine kills microorganisms. So you can also use that and then spray off your organic material, right? And then that is also creating an extract. Now, that liquid that's left over is just an extract. It's not a leachate. It's not a tea, right? We're not going to feed it. We're not going to aerate it. And we're not going to let it sit around. We're going to use it immediately. So after you've created that, you want to water whatever area that you have. If it's a tree, if it's a bush, if it's your vegetable garden, if it's your potted plants, you want to make sure that they're a little wet first, right? Nobody goes down a water. The way I kind of relate to this or tell people this is you never go down a water slide with no water, right? It just doesn't work. You get stuck at the top. It doesn't go anywhere, right? So what you're going to do, how a water slide works is the water is running through, you are going to sit in it, and then you're going to go down, but there's also water pushing you from behind, right? Because if there's no water pushing you, it's going to dry out, and then you're just going to be stuck. That's not good. So we're going to treat extract just like a water slide, right? The extract is you in that water slide. So we're going to water first the plants, right? That's the water going down the water slide. Then you're going to put the extract on. You're going to pour the extract on, right? And that's you sitting in the water slide going down. But then you got to have a little bit of water behind you pushing you down. So then we're going to water afterwards just a little bit to push those microbes down into those roots. If you've got really big trees or really deep roots, you're going to have to push that push that water down there, push those microorganisms down into that root zone. So maybe do it after a rainfall. That's a good way to do it so you're not wasting water. That way they can just kind of flow down and do it and get there. Or if it's rained and here in Vegas, we don't get a lot of rain, right? But if you live in a place, Texas, maybe if I'm getting, a thunderstorm and it's going to rain for an hour, maybe I let it rain for 20 minutes. I put the extract and then just let the rain wash the rest of the extract down into the ground. Boom, save yourself some water and some time. Now you're going to get wet, right? But that's the way that I how I use worm castings. Whether it's putting new plants in the ground, I put them right where the roots are, or if the plants are already existing, then I'm going to wash them into the root zone. So hopefully that's helpful. Now, when should I be using worm castings? Well, we already talked about like the different scenarios, but honestly, I like using them every season, the beginning of the season or the end of the season or both. Okay. The reason for that is we kind of talked about, there's different microorganisms that live in the summertime, in the wintertime, right? Or and in the areas in between. And I want to make sure I get those guys out there. So as the seasons change, I want to make sure that I'm adding the extract out or the worm castings out there with the changing season. That does the one thing which we talked about is adding the microbes there. The second thing it does is it helps plants either get established or help them through. So before spring, before we get our plants into our ground, I want to do an extract to make sure I have the microbes there. So they start cycling nutrients, right? That way, when I put the plant there, the plant's like, nutrients, yes, I'm good to go. I've got everything that I need, right? Well, right before we go into the summertime, I want to get the microbes in there too, because as the summer starts, it starts getting hot. Your plants are like, oh my God, this is torture. Why am I here? I don't want to live anymore. But if you hit them with that extract before the summer, then they can tolerate that just a little bit more, right? Some of those microbes have died off through the springtime. So we're going to hit them with more microbes so that they're like, oh, okay, I got a little bit of food here. I got a little bit more nutrients. I think I can make it through the summertime. Now, if you're struggling through the summertime, by all means, use more worm casting. Use worm castings in the right ratios and the right quantities to make sure that your plants are, behaving the way they should. Don't use too much. Again, too much worm castings is a bad thing. So I like hitting them with extract at certain points, right? So changing the seasons, that's when I usually hit them with either the worm castings, putting them in the planting hole, or hit them with the extract. Coming out of the summertime, going into the fall, if you guys have we grow pretty much 4 seasons here, right? Summer, well, we have 3 seasons, fall, winter, and summer. There's really no spring. Well, sometimes we get spring, but either way, whatever seasons you're going into, let's get back on topic. Whatever seasons you're going into, I like to do an extract or add the worm castings to the soil during those periods of time. Coming out of the summertime, it's super important because your plants are probably struggling, right? So maybe you've yanked out some of those plants. You need to get some of that biology back in there so that when the fall comes, your plants can really get established because the biology is already there. They're already creating nutrients. And the same thing goes going into winter and then coming out of winter or going into spring. So hopefully that makes sense. Depending on your situation is whether you're going to use the worm castings or whether you decide to make an extract. It's up to you, but that's what I would recommend for like when should you use them. It is extremely important to get them in the summertime. If you are here in Vegas or you're in a very harsh climate, that's the word I'm looking for, then you might have to hit them, once a week or something like that with an extract, just to kind of get them through or keep them alive. Sometimes depends on your situation, your growing area, what you got in the soil and stuff, right? But that's when I would usually use the worm castings. Now, what can you expect? Well, you can expect things to get better. So the first few things that you will see is usually the plant will bounce back within a few days, or you'll see a change in the plant. And then over the long period of time, right, over a longer period of time, you will see more moisture holding capacity in the soil. Your soil might actually even settle, like go down. And that's because the microbes are breaking down the organic material. You will see that the soil starts becoming different, as in maybe it was hard and rocky and now it's kind of a little crumbly. Maybe there's a little more structure to the soil. That's going to start happening. If you're doing testing, you're going to see biology start picking up. You're going to also see that the roots are going farther, deeper, and there's more roots sometimes, right? So that'll also happen, but you probably won't see that unless you rip your plant out of the ground. And I usually don't recommend that unless you absolutely have to, right? But in the long term, what you're going to see is those plants are just more resilient. They're going to survive. They're going to thrive. They're not going to be, attacked by so many diseases. They're not going to be attacked by all these different pests. And that's over the longer period of time. Now, it takes time to build up all of those microbes in the soil. It takes time to go from a crappy soil to a good soil. It doesn't just happen overnight. But that is definitely what you can expect to see with worm castings. Okay. I think that's all I have for you guys. I think that's it for today. Um, Worm castings are about feeding the soil and not necessarily the plant. So make sure you have food in the soil for the microbes before you add the worm castings there. Like always, keep everything covered. So make sure you have a roof on your soil, and that roof is a mulch. Doesn't matter what you use. I don't care what you use as long as you keep everything covered. That is good. Use what you have access to, right? That's what I always tell folks. If you don't have access to wood chips, then use straw. If you don't have access to straw, then use plants as a cover crop. If you don't have access to plants, then maybe you've got, landscape fabric. Whatever it is, keep your soil covered. The microbes are not going to be are going to be a lot happier. The worm casting is going to be a lot happier in that type of environment. But that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and we'll see y'all next week.